There's some really interesting research now looking at this difference between the pursuit of pleasure and the pursuit of meaning and purpose. Today, about what it might look like to unplug from mass consciousness, and also looking a little bit at the role of psychology in the way mass consciousness has been shaping us, a lot of which has been manufactured really for us by marketing and big business and all of these things. That's probably not completely news to us, but sometimes it is really interesting and helpful to look at the history and how we've landed where we are. And there's a really good doco you can still find on YouTube called The Century of the Self. It's about 3 hours long on some of this stuff, but some of the highlights I'll quote in here as well. And where psychology and marketing really began to intertwine was with Freud's nephew. His wife had a nephew living in New York City who was fascinated with his uncle's work. And he was a bit of a savvy businessman, I guess, and he figured that he could really stand to make some money off his uncle's work. Not just selling books, but what had come out of the writings where Freud was really exploring why do we do what we do, what is it that's driving human behavior. And he was the first to really lay out some of the subconscious desires and things that we're often responding to without even really being aware of it. So here is this nephew, Edward Bernays, and one of his first big projects was to work with big tobacco. The tobacco companies were plateauing in sales, and they were a bit frustrated that there was a good half of the demographic, women, who weren't really taking up smoking a lot, predominantly because it was not fashionable. Turn of the 1900s, it was frowned upon for a woman to smoke in public. So Bernays was hired to try and break into this market. And he quite cleverly chose one of the biggest events of the time was the Easter Day parade in Manhattan. And he hired a group of young debutantes to pose with cigarettes. At a particular moment, they would take out a cigarette and light up. And he also then went and tipped off the press and told them that there would actually be a group of young suffragettes that would be staging a protest with torches of freedom. So he staged this whole little event. The suffragette movement was big press at the time, so of course there was going to be coverage. And this created a link between these debutantes with their cigarettes, supposed suffragettes, were then linked. This whole imagery was linked with the idea of being a strong and independent woman and having your freedom and having your own opinion. So the connection between a cigarette and freedom was somewhat irrational. But once the emotional connection was made between cigarettes and being a strong woman and having freedom, there it was. It became an idea that really took off. And this was kind of the beginning of building an emotional connection between a product and the people, making an emotional need or want for something. Prior to this, most of marketing was really about functionality. Get this iron, it's really practical, or, buy these shoes, they're long-lasting and comfortable. The emotional component wasn't really present. The functional utility was the focus of advertising campaigns. So that really, using his uncle's work, he got right into this kind of manipulating and tapping into human drives and basic drives that kind of govern or heavily influence our behavior. So this type of marketing was the beginning of a real era of consumerism, because people were now being manipulated or influenced to build an emotional connection to products, and they were buying things that they didn't actually need. This was rather new, and largely due to the work of Bernays drawing on the work of Freud. And it went further into politics and focus groups, and there's a whole lot of stuff there that is of interest, perhaps, if you want to watch that documentary. But it was a big turning point. Australian ABC TV program called Gruen Transfer that has a very witty look at advertising. It really unpacks the messaging and the imagery and what's going on in an ad campaign and why it works. It's quite fascinating to watch. So of course, I mean, we know this, we all know this, but I think it's somewhat empowering to kind of take a closer look and go, well, why am I making these choices? Who's influencing the choices I make? I might not watch broadcast TV anymore, but I'm streaming and might be scrolling, and so all of these subliminal messages and direct messages and manipulation to buy, and often directed at women still very much. And I find it really interesting to kind of look at that and go, hang on a minute, I'd like to unplug. I'd like to own my own choices. So there's something in that. And how do we go about that? How do we go about living consciously and unplugging? Because I think what happens for a lot of us is we start to look at this and really question, that, like, I don't really want to work 9 to 5, 9 to 5, 9 to 5, rinse and repeat in a way that doesn't have meaning to me. And I think people start to wake up and don't know what to do with it. And often then we're drawn back into the cycle of wake up and I'm out, wake up and I'm out, live to the next holiday or something akin to that. So I think one of the first things is to not let the knowledge make you cynical. And this is often what I spend time with adolescents and in therapy. It's like, yeah, it's a bit like that. Don't let it knock you down. Don't let it make you cynical. Look beyond. Find your own meaning. So how do we live consciously? We need to explore what it is that is going to be better for us. If we don't want to go down a particular avenue, we need to have the strength and the enthusiasm to find our own avenues. And this is where I think we get to be more than a slave to our urges. I'm grateful Freud kind of lifted the lid on that and showed us some of what was going on. And a lot of that is, pretty bleak. He was looking at what happened in the war and he was not impressed with what he had seen of humanity at that time. But there's other psychological writing beyond that. And there are those that studied people who are flourishing, not just people who are struggling. And that's a really, really helpful end of the psychological literature, is to look at Jung and look at Maslow and look at Roberto Assagioli and people who write of thriving, humans thriving in potential. You don't have to have been around very long to realize that pursuing happiness and being a slave to our urges leads to a kind of emptiness. Even a kid starts to realize, the end of the bag of M&Ms is not fun. But going back for another bag of M&Ms isn't exactly the answer. You're stuck on a hamster wheel if we're doing this. So we do have a choice, and we want to nurture the part of us that knows there's a choice. There's some really interesting research now looking at this difference between the pursuit of pleasure and the pursuit of meaning and purpose, and I have a different way of being. There's this the hedonic well-being, which is gimme, gimme, make me happy, and then the eudaimonic well-being, which is a little more about the pursuit of potential. I think Aristotle spoke of eudaimonia, and in current literature there's a lot of work coming from Carol Riff in the US. A lot of large-scale study actually looking at happiness that is, the transitory hedonic, and then the pursuit of well-being that is more in the eudaimonic category. And the research is strongly indicating there are much better health outcomes related to eudaimonic well-being. And that's mental health and physical health. They're quite broad studies. You certainly might want to go off and look at some of her work. But it's making sense to me that pleasure seeking isn't really a long-lasting model for happiness and well-being. And the fact that we're more healthy when we're contributing, it's a really huge indicator to me that there's a part of us that is actually wired this way. There's nothing wrong with pleasure seeking. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's not enough, and we know it's not enough. Really, it's transitory. So how do we go about nurturing eudaimonic well-being? And I believe we all need to learn to be more still and to engage in mindful type activities. The mass consciousness keeps us on this treadmill of needing and moving, and it's either really fast or it's really sedentary in a depressive way. Whereas finding this way to be with ourselves that allows us to contemplate the big questions, that's important to our well-being. The fact that there isn't an immediate answer to who am I and why am I here doesn't make it a scary question. It's a great question to ponder with. And we need to go back to building a slightly slower internal tempo that has space for those contemplations, even in a busy day. I think at the moment we tend to rush through our work week to get to the time that is our time to do something, to refresh, and then back into it again. But a more mindful approach on the regular is going to be the thing that changes how we relate with the world. So the questions of who am I, why am I here, what's it all about, how can I contribute, how do I grow and be better, what is a meaningful life, all of these questions we want to be able to just sit and ponder. They're not mathematical formulations to push through. So these are questions that we need to just get comfortable with and contemplate. If we ponder on a daily, regular basis with ourselves, with regular time in contemplation and introspection, we gradually start to hear the answers in little ways, little indicators of like, oh, do more of this. Oh, try this. These are the things that are taking me towards a more authentic version of myself. And finding small ways to engage in that on the daily basis is important. I'm also a big fan of retreats and holidays and travel and hiking and big events. Those are wonderful resets. Travel will always change how we relate to ourselves and the world around us. And I think it's a great thing to do, but it's not going to build a sustainable life. We can't live to the next holiday, realistically. Well, we're not going to maximize our potential that way. It's finding a way to have some minutes alone every day where we get to reflect. It might mean listening to some peaceful music rather than putting on the TV or the streaming, or doing less scrolling, having tech-free days or tech-free afternoons where it's just really quiet and there is space to hear, to reflect, go fishing, be in some open space. Nature really does help reset a lot like this, I believe. So it's a very personal thing, but it's an important thing to find a way that you can contemplate. How is today? How did it go? How am I doing? Am I moving in the general direction that feels growthful? Am I nurturing my potential? What do I have to offer? What can I do to contribute? What makes my heart sing? And spending time in this reflective way is a key thing to unplugging from this consciousness, to being able to focus on your own conscious evolution. So spend time with yourself. Find like-minded people. They're out there. Find teachers and mentors that you can discuss things with and go for a hike with. journal, paint, do things that you know feed your soul. And we can all find those. For some people it's the beach, some people it's the mountaintop. Find hobbies, do things, be creative. Slow down and enjoy the journey. Find what it is that nourishes you and your more conscious self, the one that wants to really reach potential and have a positive impact in life.